The silence in the abandoned factory was deafening, broken only by the steady tick-tick of a device that shouldn't exist. 3 of the nation's top bomb disposal experts stood frozen, their hands trembling as they stared at the intricate web of wires and circuits before them. Each had tried and failed. Each had backed away, defeated by a complexity that seemed designed to mock their years of training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the corner, almost forgotten, stood a woman in a janitor's uniform. Her calloused hands gripped a mop handle, but her eyes were fixed on the device with an intensity that none of the experts noticed. She knew those circuits. She recognized the signature patterns, the deliberate redundancies, the psychological traps built into the design. Most importantly, she knew exactly how to disarm it. But nobody was asking the cleaning lady for her opinion. Elena Rodriguez had been cleaning the floors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Regional Training Center in Quantico for exactly 3 years, 4 months and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, least of all the agents and trainees who barely acknowledged her existence as she moved through their world like a ghost in a gray uniform. To them, she was just another invisible service worker, someone whose presence was expected but whose absence would be the only thing that might get noticed. The irony wasn't lost on her. In her previous life, she had been Special Agent Elena Martinez, one of the FBI's most decorated explosive ordnance disposal specialists. She had defused bombs in war zones, dismantled terrorist devices in major cities, and trained an entire generation of agents in the delicate art of turning death into safety, with nothing but steady hands and precise knowledge. Her techniques were still being taught in classrooms throughout the facility, though the instructors who quoted her methods had no idea their janitor had written the manual they were reading from. Elena had chosen this anonymity 3 years ago, after the incident that ended her career. The official report called it an equipment malfunction during a routine training exercise. The truth was more complicated, involving a split-second decision that saved 12 lives, but cost her everything she had worked for. When you're responsible for an explosion that destroys a federal building, even when that explosion prevents a much larger one, the bureaucracy finds ways to make you disappear. So she had disappeared, changing her last name back to her maiden Rodriguez, accepting a position that required no background checks beyond basic security clearance, and settling into a life where her most dangerous decision was which cleaning solution to use on stubborn stains. The FBI's Human Resources Department saw her as a reliable employee with previous federal experience in administrative roles. Her actual expertise in explosives was buried so deep in classified files that even she sometimes wondered if it had all been a dream. The training center buzzed with activity every morning as new recruits and experienced agents rotated through various programs. Elena had learned to time her cleaning schedule around the most interesting sessions, not because she was trying to eavesdrop, but because old habits died hard. When you've spent 15 years thinking about explosives every waking moment, it's difficult to simply turn off that part of your brain. This particular morning, she was mopping the hallway outside Classroom C when she heard the familiar voice of Instructor Davis, explaining basic circuit recognition to a group of rookie agents. Through the partially open door, she could see him holding up a training device that looked like something she had disarmed in Kandahar back in 2018. The key to understanding any explosive device, Davis was saying, is to recognize the bomber's signature. Every person who builds these things has patterns, preferences, quirks that show up in their work. The Martinez method teaches us to look for these psychological fingerprints before we even think about touching a wire. Elena paused in her mopping, struck by the surreal experience of hearing her own techniques being taught by someone who had learned them from reading her reports rather than living through the experiences that created them. The Martinez method. had been developed through trial and error in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Each principle earned through close calls and hard-won wisdom. A young agent in the front row raised his hand. "Instructor Davis, what happened to Agent Martinez?" "I've read her case studies, but there's no current information about her." Davis's expression tightened slightly. "Agent Martinez is no longer with the Bureau. Let's focus on the techniques rather than the personalities, shall we?" Elena resumed her mopping, moving past the classroom with practiced invisibility. She had grown accustomed to being erased from the official narrative, becoming a footnote in the story of methods that bore her name but not her presence. It was safer this way, she reminded herself. Cleaner. No one could question her decisions if she wasn't making any that mattered. The regional training center served multiple law enforcement agencies, hosting everything from basic police training to advanced federal programs. Elena had learned to read the schedules posted in the administrative offices, timing her work to avoid the more sensitive sessions while satisfying her curiosity about how her old field was evolving. Most of the innovations were minor refinements of techniques she had pioneered, though she noticed with some concern that the newer agents seemed more focused on technology than on the intuitive understanding that had always been the foundation of her success. Her supervisor, Janet Walsh, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been managing the facility's maintenance staff for over a decade. Janet appreciated Elena's reliability and attention to detail, though she sometimes wondered why someone with Elena's education and obvious intelligence was content to push a mop around government buildings. "Rodriguez," Janet called out as Elena finished the hallway outside the classrooms. "I need you to take care of the conference rooms on the 3rd floor. There's some big shot coming in from Washington tomorrow, and everything needs to be perfect." "Of course," Elena replied, gathering her supplies. "Any idea what the meeting is about?" "Something about updating training protocols," Janet said with a shrug. "Above my pay grade, but apparently it's important enough that they're flying people in from all over the country." Elena nodded and headed toward the elevators, but her mind was already working through the implications of what she had overheard. Updates to training protocols usually meant that someone had identified deficiencies in current methods, often the result of failures in real-world situations. As someone who had helped write many of those protocols, she found herself curious about what problems had emerged and how they were being addressed. The 3rd floor conference rooms were primarily used for high-level meetings and sensitive briefings. Elena had clearance to clean them, but only during designated hours when no classified materials were present. As she worked through the rooms, she noticed that someone had left behind a stack of documents marked with the distinctive red border that indicated restricted access materials. Protocol required her to report any classified materials left unsecured, but as she reached for her radio to call security, her eyes caught a familiar phrase on the top document: failure analysis, recent EOD incidents. Below that, in smaller text, critical assessment of Martinez method applications in complex scenarios. Elena set down her cleaning supplies and stared at the document. She knew she should call security immediately, but the professional curiosity that had driven her entire career was stronger than her commitment to following proper procedures. She glanced around the empty conference room, then carefully lifted the cover page to scan the executive summary beneath. What she read made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and professional concern. The report detailed 3 recent incidents where agents trained in her methods had failed to properly assess explosive devices, resulting in 1 fatality and significant property damage. The analysis suggested that the Martinez method, while historically successful, was proving inadequate for the increasingly sophisticated devices being encountered in the field. The criticism was technically accurate but fundamentally flawed. Elena could see immediately where the agents had misapplied her techniques, focusing on the mechanical aspects of her methods while ignoring the intuitive elements that made them effective. Her approach had always been about reading the bombers. Psychology first, then applying technical knowledge to match that understanding. These agents had apparently been taught to follow her procedures as a checklist rather than understanding the reasoning behind each step. She read further, growing more frustrated with each page. The report recommended a complete overhaul of EOD training, abandoning her psychological approach in favor of what they called systematic technical analysis. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic thinking that had driven her away from the Bureau in the first place. The belief that complex problems could be solved through rigid adherence to procedures, rather than through the kind of adaptive thinking that kept people alive in dangerous situations. A sound in the hallway made her quickly close the document and return to her cleaning. A security guard walked past the conference room without looking in, and Elena realized she had been holding her breath. She finished cleaning the room in record time, her mind racing with thoughts about the implications of what she had read. That evening, Elena sat in her small apartment reviewing everything she could remember from the report. The failures described were predictable results of teaching her methods incorrectly, but she had no way to communicate that insight without revealing her identity. The frustration of possessing knowledge that could save lives while being unable to share it was almost unbearable. Her apartment was sparse but comfortable, decorated with the kind of generic furniture that came from wanting to establish a life without attracting attention. The only personal touches were a few books on technical subjects and a small collection of succulents that thrived under her meticulous care. She had learned to find satisfaction in small things, but tonight those small satisfactions felt hollow compared to the larger problems she was powerless to address. She thought about the young agents she had seen in training, eager and confident in their newly learned skills. They had no idea that their techniques were being questioned at the highest levels, or that the methods they were learning might be inadequate for the challenges they would face. Elena had a responsibility to them, but she also had a responsibility to protect the quiet life she had built from the wreckage of her former career. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Elena was cleaning the administrative offices when she overheard a phone conversation that made her stop working entirely. Janet was speaking with someone from the Washington office, her voice tense with concern. "Yes, I understand the timeline," Janet was saying. "But are you sure our facility is equipped for that kind of demonstration? We're a training center, not an operational unit." Elena moved closer, pretending to clean the windows while straining to hear both sides of the conversation. "I see," Janet continued. "And you're confident that our current protocols are adequate? Because if something goes wrong during a live demonstration..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She paused, listening to the response. "All right, I'll make sure everything is prepared. But I want it on record that I expressed concerns about conducting this type of exercise with trainees present." After Janet hung up, Elena approached her supervisor with what she hoped appeared to be casual curiosity. "Everything all right? You seemed concerned about something." Janet looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then spoke in a low voice. "Between you and me, Rodriguez, I think someone in Washington has lost their mind. They're bringing in a live explosive device for a training demonstration tomorrow. Something they recovered from a recent case that they want to use to show the limitations of current techniques." Elena felt her blood run cold. A live device? Here at the training center? That's what they're saying. Apparently, it's some kind of sophisticated bomb that's been giving their experts trouble. They want to demonstrate why they need to change the training protocols. Janet shook her head. "In 30 years of working in federal facilities, I've never heard of anything so reckless." Elena's mind was already working through the implications. A live device brought to a training facility meant that someone was trying to make a dramatic point about the inadequacy of current methods. It also meant that trainees and instructors would be present when experts attempted to disarm something that had already proven challenging for field agents. "Do you know what time this demonstration is scheduled?" Elena asked. 10 in the morning. In the main training hall. All classes are being suspended so everyone can observe." Janet's expression was grim. "Rodriguez, I want you to make sure you're nowhere near that area tomorrow morning. I don't care what your schedule says. Find something to clean on the other side of the building." Elena nodded, but she knew she would be doing exactly the opposite. If experts were struggling with a device sophisticated enough to warrant this kind of demonstration, there was a very good chance that someone was going to need help from a person with more experience than any of the current agents possessed. The question was whether she was prepared to reveal herself in order to provide that help. That night, Elena spread her old technical manuals across her kitchen table and began refreshing her knowledge of advanced explosive devices. Her skills might be rusty from 3 years of disuse, but her understanding of bomber psychology and device construction was as sharp as ever. She studied until dawn, preparing for a situation she hoped wouldn't arise, but knew she needed to be ready for. The next morning, Elena arrived at work early and positioned herself where she could observe the setup for the demonstration without being noticed. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The device they had brought was not just sophisticated. It was actively malicious in its design, built by someone who understood exactly how bomb disposal experts thought and had deliberately incorporated features designed to defeat standard techniques. As agents and trainees began filing into the main training hall, Elena realized that she was about to witness either a successful demonstration of new methods or a catastrophic failure that could cost lives. Either way, the quiet life she had built was about to be tested in ways she had never anticipated. The morning of the demonstration arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle over the entire training facility. Elena had barely slept, her mind cycling through every possible scenario she could imagine for what was about to unfold. She arrived at work an hour early, ostensibly to complete her regular cleaning routine, but actually to position herself where she could observe the setup without drawing attention. The main training hall had been transformed overnight into something resembling an operating theater. Protective barriers had been erected around a central table where the device would be placed, with observation areas for the assembled agents and trainees. Camera equipment had been set up to broadcast the demonstration to other facilities, and Elena could see technicians testing communication systems that would allow experts from multiple locations to consult during the procedure. What troubled her most was the casual confidence she observed among the preparation staff. These were people who had read reports about the device, but had never actually worked with anything like it. They were treating this as an educational exercise rather than a potentially lethal encounter with someone's deliberate attempt to kill bomb disposal experts. Dr. Michael Harrison, the FBI's current director of explosives training, arrived at 8 in the morning with an entourage of federal officials and technical specialists. Elena recognized him from his occasional visits to the training center, though they had never interacted directly. Harrison was a former military officer who had transitioned to federal law enforcement after retiring from the Army's explosive ordnance disposal unit. His reputation was built on rigid adherence to established procedures and a deep skepticism of what he called cowboy tactics in bomb disposal work. Elena watched from the hallway as Harrison conducted a final briefing for the assembled experts who would attempt the disarmament. She could hear fragments of his presentation through the partially open doors, and what she heard confirmed her concerns about their approach. "This device represents everything that's wrong with the current training methodology," Harrison was saying. "It's designed to exploit the psychological profiling techniques that have become too central to our approach. The bomber who created this understood the Martinez method and specifically incorporated features designed to mislead agents who rely too heavily on behavioral analysis." Elena felt a flash of anger at the mischaracterization of her work, but she forced herself to remain calm and continue listening. Today's demonstration will show why we need to move toward a more systematic, technology-based approach to explosive device analysis. We have 3 of the Bureau's top EOD specialists here, each representing different schools of thought within current training. Their attempts to disarm this device will illustrate the limitations of existing methods and provide justification for the comprehensive overhaul we're proposing. The arrogance in his voice was unmistakable. Harrison wasn't just trying to prove a point about training methods. He was conducting a public execution of techniques that had saved hundreds of lives over the past decade. Elena realized that this demonstration was as much about politics and career advancement as it was about improving agent safety. At 9:30, the device itself was wheeled into the training hall on a specially designed cart. Elena had positioned herself in a maintenance closet with a clear view through a small window. And when she saw the bomb for the first time, her professional assessment was immediate and terrifying. The device was a masterpiece of malicious engineering, clearly built by someone with extensive knowledge of both explosive chemistry and bomb disposal psychology. The external appearance was deliberately misleading, designed to suggest certain internal configurations while hiding the actual triggering mechanisms. Elena could see at least 3 different booby traps incorporated into the housing, each one positioned to activate if a disposal expert followed standard procedures for devices of this apparent type. More concerning was the bomber's signature, which Elena recognized immediately. The specific combination of component placement, wire routing, and trigger redundancy was characteristic of Viktor Kozlov, a former Soviet military engineer who had been building increasingly sophisticated devices for terrorist organizations over the past 5 years. Elena had studied his work extensively during her active service, and she knew that his bombs were designed specifically to kill the people trying to disarm them. Kozlov's devices typically included multiple failure states that would cause detonation if standard EOD procedures were followed. His psychological understanding of how bomb disposal experts approached unknown devices was profound, and he used that knowledge to create what amounted to death traps for anyone who didn't understand his specific methodology. Elena watched with growing dread as the first expert, Agent Sarah Chun from the Los Angeles field office, began her initial assessment of the device. Chun was competent and experienced, but Elena could see immediately that she was falling into the trap that Kozlov had designed. Her careful examination of the external components was leading her toward conclusions that would prove fatal if she acted on them. The training hall was packed with observers, including dozens of trainees, who were watching what they believed would be an educational demonstration of proper technique. Elena realized that if this went wrong, the explosion wouldn't just kill the agent attempting the disarmament. It would also injure or kill many of the people who had come to learn from the exercise. Chun spent 20 minutes examining the device before announcing her assessment to the assembled crowd. Based on visual inspection and electronic analysis, this appears to be a pressure plate-triggered device with a secondary timer mechanism. The primary disarmament approach should focus on isolating the pressure sensor while maintaining circuit continuity to prevent timer activation. Elena knew immediately that this approach would result in detonation. Kozlov's devices typically used false pressure plates as decoys while hiding the actual triggers in locations that would be disturbed by attempts to access the obvious components. Chun was walking directly into a trap that had been designed specifically for agents trained in standard FBI techniques. Harrison nodded approvingly at Chun's assessment. Proceed with standard protocols, Agent Chen. We'll observe and document where the current methodology succeeds or fails. Elena watched in horror as Chun began working on the device, following procedures that would have been appropriate for almost any other bomb, but were exactly wrong for this particular one. Chun's careful, systematic approach was leading her toward a triggering mechanism that would activate the moment she touched what appeared to be the primary disarmament point. As Chun reached for the wire cutters that would seal her fate, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She stepped out of the maintenance closet and walked directly into the training hall, her cleaning supplies still in hand. "Stop," she said quietly, but with enough authority that Chun actually paused in her work. Harrison turned toward the interruption with obvious annoyance. "Ma'am, this is a restricted demonstration. Civilian personnel need to remain in designated areas." "That device will detonate if she cuts those wires," Elena said, setting down her mop and walking toward the barriers that surrounded the work area. The training hall fell silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Every eye was on the woman in the janitor's uniform who had just interrupted a federal demonstration being conducted by some of the nation's top experts. "Security," Harrison called out. "Please escort this woman back to her assigned area." Elena ignored the approaching security guards and addressed Chun directly. "Agent Chun, you're looking at a Kozlov device. The pressure plate is a decoy. The actual trigger is integrated into the housing seam that you'll disturb when you access the primary circuit board." Chun's hand froze over the device. She had clearly heard of Kozlov's work, and Elena's specific knowledge of the device's internal configuration was obviously more detailed than anything she had been briefed on. "Ma'am," Chun said carefully, "how do you know about the internal configuration?" "Because I've disarmed 3 of his devices before," Elena replied. "And because I wrote the technical bulletin that should have been included in your briefing materials." Harrison was now standing directly behind Elena, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're interfering with a federal training exercise. Security, remove her immediately." The security guards approached Elena, but she didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at Harrison with the kind of steady gaze that had once commanded respect in federal agencies around the world. "My name is Elena Martinez," she said clearly enough for everyone in the training hall to hear. "And if you don't let me disarm that device, a lot of people are going to die in the next few minutes." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the security guards had stopped moving, waiting to see how Harrison would respond to a revelation that had just changed everything about the situation they were facing. Elena could see the recognition dawning on faces throughout the training hall. The Martinez method they had been learning was named after the woman standing in front of them, wearing a janitor's uniform and holding the knowledge that might be the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. The shock of Elena's revelation rippled through the training hall like a physical force. Dr. Harrison's face cycled through several expressions as he processed what he had just heard, while Agent Chun remained frozen over the device, her wire cutters suspended in midair as she struggled to understand how the quiet janitor she had passed in hallways for months was suddenly claiming to be the legendary Elena Martinez. "That's impossible," Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Elena Martinez left federal service years ago. Her current whereabouts are classified." Elena reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a worn federal ID card, the kind that agents kept even after retirement as a reminder of their service. The photo showed a younger woman in professional attire, but the eyes were unmistakably the same ones now fixed on Harrison with unwavering determination. "My whereabouts aren't classified," Elena said calmly. "I'm right here, and I've been right here for 3 years, watching agents trained in my methods fail because they're being taught procedures instead of principles." Agent Chun, who had maintained her position over the device throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, if you really are Elena Martinez, then you know this device better than anyone else in this room. What should I do?" Harrison stepped forward before Elena could respond. "Agent Chun, do not deviate from established protocols based on the claims of unauthorized personnel. We don't know who this woman really is, and even if her identification is genuine, She has no current authority to direct federal operations. Elena looked at Harrison with a mixture of pity and exasperation. Dr. Harrison, in about 30 seconds. Agent Chun is going to trigger a secondary mechanism that will detonate approximately 2 pounds of C4 explosive. The blast radius will kill everyone within 15 feet of that table and seriously injure everyone else in this room. Your concern about my authority will seem remarkably trivial when you're explaining to families why their loved ones died during a training exercise. The weight of Elena's words settled over the room like a physical presence. Trainees who had been watching the demonstration as an educational experience suddenly realized they were potentially witnessing a life-or-death situation unfolding in real time. Chun's hand was trembling now as she held the wire cutters. Dr. Harrison, I need clear guidance. Do I proceed with the original plan or listen to her assessment? Harrison was clearly struggling with a decision that would define his career and potentially determine whether dozens of people lived or died. His entire reputation was built on systematic approaches to explosive device disposal, and accepting guidance from someone who had been officially discredited would undermine everything he had worked to establish. The Bureau spent significant resources investigating the incident that ended Agent Martinez's career, Harrison said, though he was clearly speaking as much to convince himself as to address the room. Her methods were deemed too dangerous for continued use. We cannot risk lives based on discredited techniques. Elena felt a familiar surge of anger at the distortion of her record, but she forced herself to remain focused on the immediate crisis. Dr. Harrison, the incident that ended my career saved 12 lives by sacrificing a building. Every technique I developed was designed to prioritize human safety over property or protocol. Right now your protocol is about to get people killed. She turned to address Chun directly, speaking with the authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. Agent Chun, look at the seam where the housing components meet, just below the pressure plate. Do you see the slight discoloration in the metal? Chun leaned closer to examine the area Elena had indicated. Yes, I see it. It looks like oxidation or corrosion. That's residue from a chemical trigger that activates when the housing is disturbed. Kozlov incorporates these triggers specifically to kill agents who follow standard disassembly procedures. The moment you access the circuit board through that seam, you'll complete a chemical reaction that will detonate the device. The technical accuracy of Elena's assessment was evident to everyone in the room with explosives training. Her knowledge of the device's internal configuration was far more detailed than anything that could have been learned from external examination. Harrison was still hesitating, caught between his institutional authority and the growing realization that Elena might be the only person present with the expertise needed to prevent catastrophe. Around him, other agents and officials were beginning to whisper among themselves, and the consensus seemed to be shifting toward giving Elena the opportunity to demonstrate her claims. Agent Tom Bradley, the second EOD specialist who had been scheduled to attempt disarmament if Chen failed, stepped forward to address Harrison directly. Sir, with all due respect, if there's even a chance that Agent Martinez's assessment is correct, we need to let her try. The risk of proceeding with standard protocols appears to outweigh the risk of deviating from them. Harrison looked around the room, seeing doubt in faces that had previously shown complete confidence in his leadership. The political calculation was becoming clear to him. If Elena was wrong and the device detonated because he had allowed unauthorized personnel to interfere, he could blame the failure on outside interference. But if he ignored her warnings and people died because of his adherence to protocol, the responsibility would be entirely his. Very well, Harrison said finally, his voice tight with reluctance. Agent Martinez, you may provide technical guidance to Agent Chun, but any deviation from established safety protocols remains your responsibility. Elena nodded, understanding that Harrison was positioning himself to avoid blame regardless of the outcome. She had dealt with this kind of bureaucratic cowardice before, and she knew that her focus needed to remain on the device rather than on the politics surrounding it. "Agent Chun, I need you to step back from the device and let me take over," Elena said, moving toward the barriers that surrounded the work area. Chun looked relieved as she handed over her tools and moved to a safer distance. "Agent Martinez, what's your assessment of the disarmament approach?" Elena approached the device with the careful confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges dozens of times before. Her first priority was to confirm her initial analysis of the bomber's signature and identify all the potential triggering mechanisms that might have been incorporated into the design. "This is definitely Viktor Kozlov's work," she said, speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "He's a former Soviet military engineer who specializes in anti-disposal devices. His bombs are designed specifically to kill the people trying to disarm them, which means that every obvious approach is probably a trap." As she spoke, Elena was conducting her own examination of the device, looking for the subtle indicators that would reveal Kozlov's actual methodology. Her approach was fundamentally different from the systematic visual inspection that Chun had performed. Instead of cataloging components and following decision trees, Elena was reading the device like a psychological profile, looking for the bomber's intentions and emotional patterns. "The primary challenge with Kozlov's devices," Elena continued, "is that he understands how bomb disposal experts think. He knows we're trained to look for certain types of circuits and triggering mechanisms, so he incorporates those elements as decoys while hiding the actual threats in unexpected locations." She pointed to various components as she spoke, explaining her reasoning to the assembled observers. "The pressure plate is functional, but not primary. The timer mechanism is real, but not the main threat. The actual trigger is integrated into what appears to be a stabilizing bracket, designed to activate when the device is moved or when someone attempts to access the internal components through the standard entry points." Elena's analysis was accompanied by a running commentary that revealed the depth of her understanding of bomber psychology. She explained how Kozlov's personal history influenced his choice of components, how his military training showed up in the precision of his construction, and how his psychological profile predicted the specific traps he would incorporate into this particular device. "The key to disarming a Kozlov device," Elena said, "is to ignore everything that looks important and focus on the components that appear to be structural or decorative. He hides his triggers in plain sight, disguised as elements that bomb disposal experts are trained to ignore." She had been working for about 10 minutes when she identified what she believed to be the actual disarmament sequence. The process would require accessing the device through an approach that violated every standard protocol, but Elena was confident that it was the only way to safely neutralize the threat. "I need everyone to move back to the maximum safe distance," Elena announced. "What I'm about to do goes against everything you've been taught about explosive device handling, but it's the only approach that will work with this particular bomber's methodology." Harrison stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Agent Martinez, I need you to explain your intended approach before proceeding. We're documenting this entire process, and I need to understand your reasoning." Elena looked at him with barely concealed impatience. "Dr. Harrison, the device has multiple anti-tampering mechanisms that are designed to activate if I spend too much time on analysis. The longer I wait, the more likely it becomes that one of the secondary triggers will activate. I need to move quickly and decisively, which means there isn't time for extended explanation." The tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable. As Elena prepared to begin the disarmament process, trainees and experienced agents alike were pressed against the back walls, understanding that they were about to witness something that would either validate or catastrophically disprove Elena's claims about her expertise. Elena's hands moved with the steady precision of someone who had performed similar operations hundreds of times before. Her first action was to remove what appeared to be a decorative element from the side of the device, revealing a hidden access panel that none of the previous examiners had noticed. Kozlov always includes a maintenance access that's designed to look like ornamentation, she explained as she worked. Standard protocols tell us to avoid disturbing non-functional components. But with his devices, the non-functional components are usually the key to safe disarmament. Through the hidden access panel, Elena could see the device's actual internal configuration, which was completely different from what the external examination had suggested. The primary explosive charge was positioned to maximize damage if triggered through any of the obvious disarmament approaches, but it could be safely isolated by interrupting a single circuit that was accessible only through the concealed panel. The circuit I need to interrupt is protected by two different anti-tampering devices, Elena continued, her voice calm despite the complexity of the task she was performing. One will trigger if I cut the wrong wire, and the other will trigger if I cut the right wire using standard tools. Kozlov designs these protections specifically to defeat the equipment and techniques that federal agents are trained to use. She reached into her maintenance kit and pulled out a tool that none of the observers recognized, a modified wire stripper that she had fabricated years earlier for dealing with exactly this type of protection system. The tool allowed her to interrupt the circuit without actually cutting the wire, bypassing the anti-tampering mechanism that would have been triggered by conventional wire cutters. This is the moment where most agents would fail, Elena said as she positioned the tool. Standard training teaches us to cut wires cleanly, but Kozlov's devices detect the electrical signature of a clean cut and interpret it as an attack. The circuit needs to be interrupted gradually, in a way that mimics natural degradation rather than deliberate sabotage. The process took nearly 5 minutes of delicate manipulation, during which the entire training hall remained absolutely silent. Elena worked with the focused concentration of someone who understood that a single mistake would kill everyone in the room. But her hands never trembled and her voice remained steady as she provided ongoing commentary about each step of the process. Finally, she straightened up and set down her tools. The device is now safe. The primary explosive charge has been isolated, and all anti-tampering mechanisms have been disabled. It can be moved and examined without risk of detonation. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the assembled agents and trainees, who had just witnessed a master class in explosive device disposal performed under conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced professionals. Elena acknowledged the recognition with a brief nod, but her attention was focused on Harrison, who was staring at the disarmed device with an expression that mixed amazement with professional embarrassment. Dr. Harrison, Elena said formally, I believe this concludes your demonstration of the limitations of current training methods. Harrison approached the device carefully, as if he still couldn't quite believe that it had been successfully disarmed. His examination confirmed what Elena had told them about the internal configuration, and he could see clearly how the standard protocols would have resulted in detonation. Agent Martinez, Harrison said quietly, your analysis was completely accurate. The approaches we were prepared to use would have triggered multiple failsafes that we didn't even know existed. Elena nodded but didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the adrenaline rush of returning to the work that had defined her professional identity for so many years. The familiar satisfaction of successfully neutralizing a lethal threat was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she had just revealed herself in a way that would make it impossible to return to the anonymity she had cultivated. Agent Chun, who had been watching the entire process with professional fascination, approached Elena with obvious respect. Ma'am, I've never seen technique like that before. The tool you used, the approach to the access panel, the way you read the bomber's intentions, it was all completely different from anything we've been taught. That's because you've been taught procedures instead of principles, Elena replied. Explosive device disposal is ultimately about understanding the person who built the bomb, not just the bomb itself. Viktor Kozlov's devices are psychological weapons as much as they are explosive weapons. You can't defeat them with checklists and standard protocols. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several senior FBI officials who had been monitoring the demonstration remotely and had rushed to the training center when they realized what was happening. Elena recognized Assistant Director Robert Kane, who had been her direct supervisor during her final years of active service. Kane approached Elena with a mixture of professional respect and personal concern. "Elena, I never expected to see you here, especially not under these circumstances. When we heard that someone claiming to be you had intervened in the demonstration, I honestly thought it was some kind of security breach." "It wasn't a security breach, Bob," Elena replied, using the informal name she had always used with Kane. "It was a training exercise that was about to become a mass casualty event because no one bothered to properly analyze the device before attempting disarmament." Kane looked around the training hall, taking in the faces of the agents and trainees who had just witnessed Elena's demonstration. "Elena, we need to talk, privately. There are questions that need to be answered about why you're here and what this means for your status with the Bureau." Elena understood the implications of Kane's request. Her intervention had saved lives, but it had also raised questions about her presence at a federal facility and her access to sensitive information. The bureaucratic machinery would need to determine how to classify her actions and what consequences might follow. "I understand the situation, Bob," Elena said. "But before we have that conversation, I think Dr. Harrison needs to address the fundamental problems with the training modifications he's been proposing." All eyes turned to Harrison, who had been quietly examining the disarmed device and trying to process the implications of what he had just witnessed. His entire argument for overhauling EOD training had been based on the assumption that existing methods were inadequate for dealing with sophisticated devices. Elena's successful disarmament had not only proven that assessment wrong, it had demonstrated that the real problem was in how those methods were being taught and applied. "Agent Martinez," Harrison said slowly, "your demonstration has clearly shown that our analysis of recent EOD failures was incomplete. The methods you used today are supposedly part of current training protocols, but none of our agents demonstrated the kind of understanding you showed." Elena nodded. "That's because you've been teaching my methods as a series of steps to follow rather than as a way of thinking about explosive devices. The Martinez method isn't a checklist, Dr. Harrison. It's an approach to understanding bomber psychology and using that understanding to predict how devices will be configured and protected." Kane stepped forward to address the broader group that had gathered around the disarmed device. "I think it's clear that we need to reassess our current training protocols and determine how to better incorporate the insights that Agent Martinez has demonstrated today." Elena looked around the training hall, seeing faces that reflected a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and concern. She had successfully prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure, but she had also destroyed the quiet life she had built over the past 3 years. There would be no returning to anonymity after what had happened today. "Assistant Director Kane," Elena said formally, "I'd like to request a meeting to discuss how the Bureau can improve its EOD training programs. I believe there are significant deficiencies in current methods that are putting agents at unnecessary risk." Kane nodded immediately. "Absolutely. I think we need to have a comprehensive discussion about your insights and recommendations." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Elena found herself surrounded by agents and trainees who wanted to ask questions about her techniques and her analysis of the device. For the first time in 3 years, she was being treated as the expert she had always been, and the recognition felt both satisfying and overwhelming. Agent Bradley, who had been scheduled as the backup EOD specialist, approached Elena with obvious admiration. "Agent Martinez, I've studied your case reports for years, but seeing you work in person was completely different from reading about. Your methods, the way you read that device, it was like you were having a conversation with the bomber himself." Elena smiled at the accuracy of Bradley's observation. "In a way, that's exactly what I was doing. Victor Kozlov has a distinctive personality that shows up in all of his work. Once you understand his psychological patterns, his devices become much more predictable." The conversation continued for another hour, with Elena answering questions about bomber psychology, device analysis, and the philosophical approach that had made her method so effective. She realized that she was teaching again, sharing knowledge and insights that could save lives in the field. As the training hall finally emptied, Elena found herself alone with Kane and Harrison, facing questions about her future that she had been avoiding for 3 years. The demonstration had proven her continued expertise, but it had also raised issues about her employment status and her relationship with the Bureau. "Elena," Kane said gently, "we need to discuss what happens next. Your intervention today was clearly justified and probably prevented multiple casualties, but there are procedural issues we need to address." Elena nodded, understanding that her actions had created complications that would need to be resolved through official channels. "I know, Bob. I'm prepared to answer any questions you have about my presence here and my decision to intervene." Harrison, who had been quietly processing the implications of the day's events, finally spoke up. "Agent Martinez, I owe you an apology. My assessment of your methods was based on incomplete information and institutional bias. What you demonstrated today was clearly superior to anything we've been teaching." Elena looked at Harrison with something approaching sympathy. She understood the pressure he had been under to justify changes to established protocols, and she knew that admitting error in such a public forum required a kind of professional courage that not everyone possessed. "Dr. Harrison," Elena said, "the goal should be to prevent EOD failures, not to assign blame for past mistakes. If you're willing to reconsider your approach to training, I'd be happy to work with you to develop better methods for teaching bomber psychology and device analysis." The offer represented a fundamental shift in Elena's thinking about her future. For 3 years, she had been hiding from the responsibility and recognition that came with her expertise. Today's events had proven that she couldn't really escape that responsibility, and perhaps it was time to stop trying. Kane looked back and forth between Elena and Harrison, clearly recognizing the potential for a collaboration that could significantly improve federal EOD training. "Elena, are you saying you'd be interested in returning to an active role in explosives training?" Elena considered the question carefully before responding. She had built a quiet life as a custodian, finding peace in simple tasks and anonymous service. But today had reminded her of the satisfaction that came from using her skills to protect people, and she realized that hiding those skills might be a form of selfishness that she could no longer justify. "I'm saying I'm interested in making sure that agents receive the training they need to survive encounters with sophisticated explosive devices," Elena replied. "Whether that requires an official role or can be accomplished through consultation and advisory work, I'm open to discussion." As the 3 of them prepared to leave the training hall, Elena took one final look at the device she had disarmed. It would be analyzed thoroughly over the next few days, providing additional insights into Victor Kozlov's methods and confirming the technical details of her assessment. But the more important outcome of the day's events was the recognition that effective EOD training required more than just procedural knowledge. The quiet janitor who had cleaned floors and avoided attention for 3 years was about to become Elena Martinez again, with all the responsibility and recognition that came with that identity. The question now was whether she was ready to embrace that role and use her expertise to prevent the kind of failures that had brought her to this moment. Walking out of the training hall alongside two of the FBI's senior officials, Elena realized that her period of hiding was over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to use her skills in service of something larger than her own desire for anonymity. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to finding out what those challenges might be. 3 weeks after the demonstration that changed everything, Elena sat in a conference room at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., reviewing training protocols that would reshape how federal agents approached explosive device disposal. The transformation from anonymous janitor to senior consultant had happened with startling speed, driven by urgent recognition that the Bureau's EOD training program needed fundamental restructuring. Assistant Director Kane had moved quickly to formalize Elena's return to federal service, though not without navigating significant bureaucratic obstacles. Her official separation from the FBI 3 years earlier had been classified as voluntary resignation under administrative review, which created legal complications for reinstating her security clearance and professional credentials. The solution had been to bring her back as an independent contractor with specialized consulting authority, a designation that provided the flexibility needed to utilize her expertise while avoiding the political complexities of full reinstatement. The meeting room was filled with senior officials from multiple agencies, including representatives from the DA, ATF, and military explosive ordnance units. Elena recognized many of the faces from her previous career, though the relationships had inevitably shifted now that she was returning as someone who had been proven right about training deficiencies that had cost lives. Dr. Harrison sat directly across from her, a changed man from the arrogant administrator who had nearly caused a catastrophe at the training center. The public nature of his error, combined with Elena's demonstration of superior expertise, had forced him into a position of professional humility that seemed to have genuinely transformed his approach to leadership. Rather than defending his previous positions, he had become one of the most vocal advocates for implementing Elena's recommended changes. The preliminary analysis of recent EOD failures shows a consistent pattern, Harrison was saying, referring to a thick folder of case files spread across the conference table. In every incident where agents were injured or killed attempting to disarm explosive devices, the failure can be traced to misapplication of psychological profiling techniques rather than to deficiencies in the techniques themselves. Elena nodded, though she took no satisfaction in being proven correct at the cost of agent casualties. The problem is that my methods were being taught as mechanical procedures rather than as analytical frameworks. Agents were memorizing steps instead of learning to think like their adversaries. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the Bureau's current Director of Training Operations, leaned forward with obvious interest. Agent Martinez, can you be more specific about how we should modify the curriculum to address this issue? Elena had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for exactly this question, developing a comprehensive training program that would address the fundamental philosophical differences between procedural and psychological approaches to explosive device disposal. Her recommendations represented a complete departure from current methods, emphasizing adaptive thinking over rigid protocols. The core change needs to be in how we teach agents to approach unknown devices, Elena explained, pulling out a series of training materials she had developed. Instead of starting with technical analysis of components and circuits, we need to begin with psychological analysis of the bomber. Who built this device? What were they trying to accomplish? How do they think about their targets and their opposition? She spread several photographs across the table, each showing a different explosive device that had been encountered in recent operations. Look at these devices and tell me what you see. The assembled officials examined the images carefully, offering observations about construction techniques, component choices, and apparent sophistication levels. Their analysis was thorough and technically accurate, but Elena could see that they were missing the psychological insights that would have revealed the device's true nature. "Everything you've identified is correct," Elena said, "but it's also irrelevant to successful disarmament. You're looking at what the bomber built, but you're not seeing why they built it that way." She pointed to the first photograph, which showed a relatively simple device recovered from a domestic terrorism incident. This bomber used commercially available components assembled with minimal technical sophistication. Standard analysis would classify it as a low-skill threat requiring basic disarmament procedures. But look at the component placement and wiring patterns. Elena traced her finger across specific elements of the device's construction, highlighting details that the other observers had overlooked. The bomber positioned every component to maximize psychological impact on disposal experts. The timer is visible and prominent, designed to create time pressure that would force hasty decisions. The wiring is deliberately tangled and confusing, intended to overwhelm agents with apparent complexity while hiding the actual triggering mechanism. The insight was immediately apparent to everyone in the room, though it required Elena's explanation. To make the psychological manipulation visible, the bomber had been targeting the mental state of disposal experts as much as their technical knowledge, using their own training and instincts against them. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that agents need to develop," Elena continued, moving to the next photograph. "Every bomber has psychological patterns that show up in their work, and those patterns are much more reliable indicators than technical specifications." Agent Torres was taking detailed notes as Elena spoke. "How do we teach agents to recognize these psychological patterns?" "It seems like the kind of intuitive knowledge that develops over years of experience." "That's the traditional assumption, but I believe it can be taught systematically," Elena replied. "The key is to structure training around case studies that emphasize psychological analysis rather than technical procedures. Agents need to study bombers as much as they study bombs." Kane, who had been quietly observing the discussion, spoke up with a question that Elena had been anticipating. "Elena, this approach requires a fundamental shift in how we think about explosive device threats. Are you confident that agents can develop this kind of psychological insight without compromising their technical skills?" Elena had wrestled with this question extensively during her 3 weeks of preparation. The psychological approach that had made her successful was inherently more complex and demanding than procedural methods, requiring agents to maintain both technical competence and analytical sophistication under life-threatening pressure. Assistant Director Kane: "I believe the technical skills become more effective when they're guided by psychological understanding," Elena responded. "An agent who understands a bomber's mindset will make better decisions about which technical approaches to use and when to abandon standard procedures in favor of adaptive responses." She pulled out additional training materials that she had developed, including detailed bomber profiles and decision-making frameworks that would guide agents through psychological analysis. "The curriculum I'm proposing would actually increase technical training time while adding psychological components. Agents would graduate superior capabilities in both areas." Harrison, who had remained thoughtful throughout the discussion, raised a concern that reflected his own recent experience with the limitations of rigid thinking. "Agent Martinez, how do we prevent this psychological approach from becoming just another set of procedures to memorize? The risk is that agents will learn to follow psychological checklists instead of developing genuine analytical insight." Elena smiled at the perceptiveness of Harrison's question. His transformation from defensive administrator to thoughtful collaborator had been one of the unexpected benefits of the training center incident, and his insights were proving valuable in developing better approaches to agent education. "Dr. Harrison, that's exactly the right concern," Elena said. "The solution is to structure training around scenario-based exercises that require agents to develop their own analytical approaches rather than following predetermined frameworks." They need to learn to think, not just to remember. Over the following hours, Elena outlined a comprehensive training program that would revolutionize how federal agents approached explosive device disposal. The program emphasized mentorship over instruction, with experienced agents working closely with trainees to develop individualized analytical skills. Case studies would focus on understanding bomber psychology and motivation rather than memorizing device specifications. Field exercises would present agents with scenarios that required adaptive thinking and creative problem-solving. The most significant change was Elena's proposal to establish regional expertise centers, where agents could receive ongoing training and consultation throughout their careers, rather than treating EOD training as a single certification process. The new approach would recognize explosive device analysis as a continuously evolving skill that required lifelong learning and adaptation. The expertise centers would serve as repositories for institutional knowledge about bomber psychology and device evolution. Elena explained, as new threats emerge and existing bombers modify their techniques, the centers would analyze those changes and disseminate updated guidance to agents in the field. Agent Torres looked up from her extensive notes. Agent Martinez, this sounds like a massive undertaking that would require significant resources and institutional commitment. Do you believe the Bureau is prepared to make that level of investment in EOD training? Elena looked around the conference room, seeing faces that reflected both excitement about the possibilities and concern about the challenges involved in implementing such comprehensive changes. She understood that her recommendations would require not just financial resources but also a fundamental cultural shift within federal law enforcement. Agent Torres, I believe the Bureau cannot afford not to make this investment, Elena replied. The cost of implementing better training programs is negligible compared to the cost of continued EOD failures. Every agent injury or death that could have been prevented through superior preparation represents both a human tragedy and an institutional failure. Kane leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications of Elena's proposals. Elena, assuming we move forward with implementing these changes, what role do you envision for yourself in the new training program? The question forced Elena to confront decisions about her future that she had been avoiding since her dramatic return to prominence 3 weeks earlier. Her successful intervention at the training center had proven that she still possessed the skills and knowledge that had made her legendary within the explosive device disposal community, but it had also reminded her of the intense pressure and responsibility that came with that expertise. Assistant Director Kane, I'm prepared to serve in whatever capacity best supports agent safety and training effectiveness, Elena said carefully. Whether that means developing curriculum, mentoring senior agents, or providing consultation on complex cases, I'm committed to preventing the kinds of failures that have been costing lives. Kane nodded, but Elena could see that he was looking for a more specific commitment. Elena, what I'm really asking is whether you're prepared to return to operational status. Your demonstration at the training center showed that you remain one of the most capable EOD specialists in the country, and there are ongoing cases that could benefit from your direct involvement. The question hung in the air as Elena considered her response. Returning to operational status would mean accepting responsibility for life and death decisions under the kind of pressure that had defined her previous career. It would also mean giving up the quiet anonymity that had provided 3 years of healing and reflection after the incident that had driven her away from federal service. But Elena also recognized that her skills and experience represented resources that could save lives in ways that curriculum development and training consultation could not. There were bombers operating in the field whose psychological patterns she understood better than any other agent, and there were devices being encountered that required the kind of adaptive expertise she had demonstrated at the training center. Assistant Director Kane, I'm willing to consider operational assignments on a case-by-case basis, Elena said finally. I believe I can be most effective by combining operational work with training development, using real-world experience to continuously improve the education we provide to other agents. Kane smiled at Elena's response, clearly pleased that she was willing to return to active service even in a limited capacity. Elena, I think that arrangement would benefit everyone involved. Your operational experience would inform better training programs, and your training expertise would improve operational outcomes. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Elena providing detailed answers to questions about implementation timelines, resource requirements, and coordination with other agencies. By the time the session concluded, she had secured approval for a pilot program that would test her training methods at 3 regional facilities over the following 6 months. As the officials filed out of the conference room, Harrison approached Elena with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal gratitude. Agent Martinez, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of developing these new approaches. What happened at the training center was a wake-up call that I desperately needed. Elena looked at Harrison, seeing genuine humility and commitment to improvement that had replaced his previous arrogance and defensiveness. Dr. Harrison, the best thing about mistakes is the opportunity they provide for learning. Your willingness to acknowledge error and work toward better solutions is exactly the kind of leadership the training program needs. Kane waited until the room was empty except for Elena before approaching her with a more personal conversation. Elena, I have to ask how you're feeling about everything that's happened over the past few weeks. 3 weeks ago you were cleaning floors and trying to stay invisible. Now you're redesigning federal training programs and preparing to return to operational work. Elena considered Kane's question carefully, recognizing that it touched on psychological and emotional issues that she had been processing since her dramatic return to prominence. Bob, I'm still adjusting to the change, but I'm also realizing that hiding from my expertise was never really a sustainable solution. The skills and knowledge I developed over 15 years of EOD work represent responsibilities that I can't just abandon because of one difficult experience. Kane nodded understandingly. Elena, I've reviewed the classified files about the incident that ended your active career. What you did saved lives, even though the immediate consequences were politically complicated. The Bureau should never have allowed you to feel like you needed to disappear. The acknowledgement was something Elena had been waiting to hear for 3 years, though she realized that her perspective on the incident had evolved significantly during her time away from federal service. The guilt and self-doubt that had driven her into hiding had been replaced by a more balanced understanding of the complex decisions that EOD specialists faced every day. Bob, I think my time away was actually valuable for developing the insights that are driving these training improvements, Elena said. Working as a custodian gave me a different perspective on institutional culture and the ways that expertise can be overlooked or misused. Those insights are informing the program changes we discussed today. Kane looked thoughtful at Elena's observation. Elena, do you think there are other valuable people working in non-obvious roles throughout federal agencies? People whose expertise we're not recognizing or utilizing effectively? Elena considered the question, thinking about the various service workers, contractors, and support personnel she had encountered during her 3 years of anonymity. Bob, I think there's tremendous untapped expertise throughout the federal workforce, but it requires leadership that's willing to look beyond titles and credentials to identify actual capabilities. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone buzzing with an urgent message from the FBI's Explosive Device Analysis Unit. A sophisticated bomb had been discovered at a major transportation hub, and initial analysis suggested it might be the work of Viktor Kozlov, the bomber whose device Elena had successfully disarmed at the training center. Kane read the message over Elena's shoulder and immediately understood the implications. Elena, this could be your first operational assignment under the new arrangement. Are you prepared to respond immediately? Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied high-stakes EOD situations, but this time it was tempered by 3 years of reflection and the confidence that came from her recent, successful demonstration. Bob, I'm ready, but I want to bring Agent Chun with me as a learning opportunity. She showed good instincts during the training center incident, and this could be valuable experience for her. Kane nodded approvingly at Elena's suggestion. Elena, that's exactly the kind of mentorship approach that we discussed implementing in the new training program. Chun could benefit enormously from working with you on a complex case. Within an hour, Elena found herself on a federal aircraft heading toward Chicago, where the suspicious device had been discovered in Union Station during routine security screening. Agent Chun sat beside her, reviewing case files on Victor Kozlov while Elena explained the psychological patterns that made his devices so dangerous. Agent Chun, the key to understanding Kozlov is recognizing that he's not trying to cause maximum casualties, Elena was explaining as they reviewed intelligence reports. His goal is to kill the people who try to stop him. Every device he builds is specifically designed to defeat the techniques that bomb disposal experts use. Chun nodded, clearly absorbing every detail of Elena's analysis. Agent Martinez, how do you develop the confidence to approach devices that are specifically designed to kill you? It seems like the psychological pressure alone would be overwhelming. Elena smiled at the perceptiveness of Chun's question. Agent Chun, the confidence comes from understanding that Kozlov's psychological warfare cuts both ways. If you understand his mindset better than he understands yours, you can predict his moves and counter them effectively. The key is to think like him without becoming like him. As their aircraft descended toward Chicago, Elena realized that she was returning to operational work not as the same person who had left 3 years earlier, but as someone who had gained new perspectives on the relationship between expertise and service. Her time as a custodian had taught her that meaningful work could be found in any role, but it had also reinforced her understanding that specialized skills carried responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned without consequences. The device at Union Station would test Elena's operational capabilities and provide an opportunity to demonstrate the training methods she had been developing. But more importantly, it would represent her complete transition from hidden janitor back to active agent, using her expertise in service of protecting the public from sophisticated threats. As they prepared to land, Elena reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, she had been an anonymous service worker trying to avoid attention and responsibility. Now she was preparing to face one of the world's most dangerous bombers while mentoring the next generation of EOD specialists. The quiet woman who had cleaned floors and stayed invisible was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true expertise carried obligations that transcended personal comfort or professional politics. Elena Martinez was returning to the work that defined her, but she was returning with wisdom earned through adversity and perspectives gained through service in unexpected roles. The aircraft touched down at O'Hare International Airport, where a team of federal agents was waiting to transport Elena and Chun to Union Station. As they disembarked, Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But this time it was balanced by confidence in her abilities and clarity about her purpose. At Union Station, Elena's analysis of the device confirmed her initial assessment that it was indeed Victor Kozlov's work, but with modifications that reflected his awareness of the techniques she had used to defeat his previous bombs. The psychological chess match between bomber and disposal expert was continuing to evolve, requiring Elena to adapt her methods while maintaining the fundamental insights that made her approach successful. The disarmament process took nearly 4 hours, during which Elena provided continuous commentary for Chun and the other agents observing the operation. Her running analysis demonstrated the real-time application of psychological profiling techniques, showing how understanding Kozlov's mindset guided every decision about which wires to cut and which components to avoid. When the device was finally rendered safe, Elena realized that she had not only successfully completed her first operational assignment in 3 years, but had also provided a practical demonstration of the training methods she had been developing. The combination of technical expertise and psychological insight had proven effective once again, validating her approach to reforming federal EOD education. In the aftermath of the successful operation, Elena found herself surrounded by agents and officials who wanted to understand her methods and learn from her example. The recognition was gratifying, but what satisfied her most was the knowledge that her expertise was being used to protect people and improve the capabilities of other agents. Agent Chun approached her as the scene was being secured, her face reflecting a mixture of admiration and newfound understanding. "Agent Martinez, watching you work today was completely different from anything I learned in training. You weren't just following procedures. You were having a conversation with the bomber through his device." Elena nodded at the accuracy of Chun's observation. "Agent Chun, that's exactly what effective EOD work requires. The bomber is trying to communicate his intentions and capabilities through the device he builds. Your job is to understand that communication and respond appropriately." As they prepared to return to Washington, Elena realized that her transformation from hidden janitor to active agent was complete, but that the real work was just beginning. The training program she had designed would take months to implement, and the cultural changes needed to support psychological approaches to EOD work would require sustained effort from leadership throughout federal law enforcement. But Elena was no longer hiding from the responsibility that came with her expertise. She was ready to use her skills and knowledge to prevent the kinds of failures that had been costing lives, and to train the next generation of agents to think as effectively as they acted. The quiet woman who had pushed a mop and avoided attention was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true service sometimes required accepting recognition and responsibility, rather than seeking anonymity. Elena Martinez had found her way back to the work that defined her, but she had returned with wisdom that would make her more effective than she had ever been before. 6 months later, Elena stood in the main training hall at Quantico, watching a group of new agents successfully disarm training devices using the psychological analysis techniques she had developed. The pilot program had exceeded all expectations, with agent performance improving dramatically under the new curriculum. Dr. Harrison, who had become one of Elena's closest collaborators in developing the program, approached her with the latest statistics from the field. "Elena, EOD incident rates are down 60% among agents trained under the new program. More importantly, there have been 0 fatalities in complex device scenarios where agents applied psychological profiling techniques." Elena smiled at the numbers, though she knew that the real measure of success would be sustained performance over years rather than months. "Dr. Harrison, the key now is to maintain the quality of instruction as we expand the program. The temptation will be to turn these methods into procedural checklists, which would defeat the entire purpose." As she watched the training exercise conclude, Elena realized that her journey from hidden janitor to recognized expert had accomplished something more than just returning to her previous role. She had developed new approaches to sharing expertise and training others, approaches that would benefit the EOD community for decades to come. The woman who had once cleaned floors in anonymity was now shaping the future of federal explosive device disposal training, but she had not forgotten the lessons learned during her time in service roles that others might have considered insignificant. True expertise, she had learned, could be found in unexpected places, and effective service sometimes required the courage to remain hidden as much as the courage to step forward. Elena Martinez had reclaimed her identity as one of the nation's premier EOD specialists. But she had done so with wisdom earned through adversity and perspectives gained through service in roles that had taught her as much about human nature as her federal career had taught her about explosive devices. She was ready for whatever challenges the future might bring, confident in her abilities but humble about the responsibilities they carried. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.